Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Hey, and thanks for listening into the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined by author, speaker, editor, activist, and all-around ninja, Dr. Reverend Derek Penwell. So, hello.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having me.
I meant to ask you, does the ninja apply to anything specific, or is it like metaphorical ninja?
No, it's just being a smart aleck.
Good. Let's see. Derek is, like I said, he's a senior pastor of Douglas Boulevard Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. It's Louisville because around here in Colorado there's a Louisville, but this is Louisville, Kentucky, and a lecturer at the University in Religious Studies and Humanities. He has a PhD from, is it U of L, right? U of L?
Yeah,
U of
University
L?
of Louisville. Huh?
And author of articles ranging from church history to aesthetic theory and tragic emotion. So we'll be talking about his book today, Outlandish, An Unlikely Messiah, a Messy Ministry, and a Call to Mobilize. But first, Derek, what else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Well, I've been a disciple now for almost 30 years, but I grew up in the Evangelical church. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the Christian Churches of Christ, sort of kissing cousins to the disciples.
Yeah.
And my father worked in the evangelical publishing industry for most of his career. He was a director of marketing for Zondervan, and then he became an acquisitions editor for a couple of other places, and he worked for Hendrickson out in Massachusetts and so forth. But anyway, that whole scene felt like a kind of betrayal to the gospel that I had been studying. Or not a betrayal, but I think probably a misreading is a better way to say it.
Okay. Yeah.
So I became, especially around the issues of women in ministry and ecumenism and so forth. I thought that was all really important, and that was not something that I grew up with. And so I did one master's degree at Emmanuel School of Religion in Johnson City, Tennessee.
Okay. Yeah.
In church history, and then I did my MDiv at Lexington Theological Seminary, and that's when I sort of, the first time I was ever in a disciples church was when I was doing the what do they call it? The sermon where they're going to vote on you as a student pastor. So
candidate, whatever.
Yeah. So, and I've been in Kentucky since 1991.
Well, awesome. So for our listeners, Derek and I, when Derek used the word disciples, he's referring to denomination that Derek and I are both clergy in, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And we have a long storied history, I guess we might say.
Absolutely.
As part of what's historically referred to as the Restoration Movement. And Derek is alluding to one splinter wing. I guess it depends on your perspective, right? The Christian Church, Independent Christian Church, or Churches of Christ. Derek and I can see each other on Zoom here, so I don't know if Derek, if you can see, like over my right, I don't know, left shoulder is the big encyclopedia. Which have you seen that Stone Campbell encyclopedia? That's a classic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, what has it meant then would you share, like, what has it meant for you to be a Christian in the past, and what has changed for you, if anything?
Well, what I learned growing up was pretty standard evangelical fare, which is to say, the emphasis was always on a kind of personal relationship between you and Jesus, you and God, and men, you were supposed to be a moral person, but that morality was often sort of centered on, your genitals, and and failed to account for, what I take to be the much bigger message of both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, which is our responsibility to the vulnerable, and the way that we live both as a presence, Christ's presence here in the world, and how that presence manifests in our relationships with the government, with educational institutions, with across the board. It has an impact on how we deal with other people, and that is really sort of the hallmark of what it means, in my estimation, to be a Christian.
Great. What spiritual practices have become meaningful to you, or might you recommend to others?
I obviously prayer, and meditation. Although I must say, I'm really not as great at those things as I would want to be, and I think probably temperamentally, I find more sort of nourishment in study, and reading. And then the other thing is that I think often sort of gets short shrift when we talk about spirituality is the extent to which our public life, the way we engage in the pursuit of peace and justice, is itself a spiritual practice. So being out in the world is a spiritual practice. They used to have a thing here at Douglas, at the church here. They called it Wednesday nights worship on your feet. And so you would go out, and you would go to a soup kitchen, or whatever that was. But the implication was that spirituality is not always sort of centered around my own experience, but in my communal relationships with the those who gather together as followers of Jesus, and also the relationships we have with the rest of the people who have no real interest in the church or anything else.
I'm seeing that theme of the public versus the private kind of play out into your book here.
Yes.
So, well, let's jump into that then, if we can.
Sure.
So, Derek, when was this published? 2018, 2019?
2019, February of 2019.
So, boy, it doesn't seem that long ago, but it has been. It's hard to keep track of time in COVID world, but the title is An Unlikely Messiah, or Outlandish, An Unlikely Messiah, A Messy Ministry, and the Call to Mobilize. And so tell us a little bit about just the big picture of the book, if you would.
Yeah, interestingly, my working title when I proposed the book was Political Subversive, Why Jesus Was Such a Lousy Messiah. And the publisher thought that might be off-putting to potential buyers, readers. So they came up with this, and this is an outgrowth, the book itself, at least the structure of it, of when I do world religions and I'm introducing Christianity to my students. I call it the unlikelies, and it's about how Jesus is an unlikely Messiah, that his calling of the disciples was very unlikely. Who actually followed? He hung around with an unlikely crowd. He angered the people who were it's an unlikely political campaign strategy to make everybody at the top mad. But that's sort of how it came about.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, as here we are, like 60 some days as we're recording this from the election, and
54 as it turns out.
Oh my goodness.
I haven't counted the hours and seconds, but
oh my goodness. Speaking of politics, you have this quote from your book that I think really encapsulates in my mind what the book is about. So you say, contrary to popular opinion, Jesus didn't come to save your soul. He came to subvert your politics. So there's a lot there. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, my experience of Christianity growing up as an evangelical, and what I take to be the kind of placeholder for Christianity in popular culture today, is this assumption that Christianity is about getting your soul saved. And as you know, as I was told in Christian service camp or whatever growing up, your job is to get, is to save your soul and take as many people, get to heaven and take as many people along with you as you can.
Right. Yeah.
Unfortunately, what that does, and I came to believe over time, is leave out some really important issues that Jesus takes up in the Gospels, as well as the prophets, and to a certain extent Paul, and even in the law in the Hebrew Scriptures. It really is about forming and sustaining a community of believers who are first and foremost concerned with the life and livelihood and flourishing of everyone, and not just the people with power. And so I grew up with this understanding that, which I think is pretty common for most people, that religion and politics ought not to mix.
Right.
You just keep the two away from each other. But I think that's a misunderstanding of politics, because technically what politics is it concerns itself with the life we live, the common life we live together, and how that is ordered and structured. It comes from the Greek word polis. And so politics is something that we do all the time. What I think people have a problem with, and I do to a certain extent too, although probably not as much as many folks, what I think they mean is partisan politics.
Right.
Sort of taking one side over another in political contests.
Endorsement of people, candidates, parties.
But there's no way that you can read the Gospels, I think, and come away thinking, Jesus really doesn't care how we structure our society, who we look after, and who gets to use all the power and stuff. I mean, it's just as impossible to me to think of our faith and how that manifests apart from the impact that we have on the world around us. And so what I say in the book is that we need to recover a sense of what politics means and how it is that religion is inherently political, because it's about how we order our lives together.
Yeah. I love that, because I thought about politics for a long time as being at its most basic sense, like how we live together in community. And I think if we thought about like that, like government is just about how we treat one another as we interact. So
yeah, I mean, as John Dominic Crossan points out, when you talk about kingdom of God, kingdom is inherently political, and God is obviously religious, and there's no way to separate the two. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that Jesus and the people that he ministered to and challenged did not think about that was a false kind of dichotomy, religion and politics. They're both implicated in how it is that we assign power, and who gets forgotten, and all of that kind of stuff.
Let me ask a follow-up question, if I may.
Sure.
You mentioned like the kingdom of God, and certainly probably you've seen it as much as I have, this trend to take away kingdom language and talk about kingdom. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but as much as I understand the sentiment, I do wonder if it kind of like devalues, or I don't know if that's the right word, takes away kind of the impetus of what. Because if what you're saying is true, that there was a political movement, by saying kingdom versus kingdom, like we're kind of taking away some of that oomph. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's part of the thing I struggle with in the book, is to say, I typically talk about it as the reign of God, or God's new realm, or that kind of stuff. But I want to be clear, and so I continue to use in the book kingdom of God on purpose, and I make that explicit because it retains the political flavor that I think is inherent in what it is we're talking about.
Yeah,
I wish there were a better word. I mean, and I understand the argument about using kingdom as a kind of communal sort of thing, but for my purposes in writing this book, it just didn't capture what I wanted to highlight, which was the politics of it.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about politics, and as we've come through this summer, we're in September as we're recording this, kind of come through so much with COVID and the unrest over these so many it seems like unjust killings of African American individuals, just so much broader unrest, continuing protests. And I think a lot of churches, a lot of communities of faith have thought about, like, how do we live faithfully as followers of Jesus in this current context that we're in? I know probably you've seen this a lot, Derek. I've seen this online, like people saying like, hey, you've always wondered what you would do during the civil rights movement of the 60s. Like, hey, we're in it again. So I know I'm thinking about that as an individual, as a pastor, as a church leader. So in your book, you highlight, and I meant to ask you how you pronounce this, the story of, say this for me, Les Chambon.
Oh, Les Chambon.
Yeah, that was close. I'll give. So tell our listeners kind of the general story of that.
So Les Chambon actually encompassed an area in southeastern France, in the Vichy region of France during World War II.
Okay.
And it became a kind of model. And in fact, where I first came across it was doing research for part of the philosophical portion of my dissertation. And what was significant about Les Chambons was this whole community. They protected Jews throughout the war, and the philosophical question revolves around supererogation, right?
Okay.
Which is a philosophical term, ethical term for sort of over and above, beyond what can be expected. And the issue is, how do you get a community to act that way that appears to be heroic to everybody else? Like, how did they do it? And over the course of the years, they never once cracked. Nobody sort of informed or anything. And they saved thousands of lives of Jews, and both German and French and other European Jews. They would hide them. They would make, false papers for them, and they set up a school for them and everything. They took them into their homes. And the question was, can you make a heroic community? Well, the answer to that is probably not. Partly because most people don't see themselves as heroic. So what you have to do is you have to raise the level of moral expectation to a communal level, so that when all these people are interviewed after the war, they, and people are just sort of amazed, how did you all do this? And their answer was, what? We did what anybody would have done. Yeah. Clearly, though,
it's not.
They didn't do what everybody would have done. They did something more. And how do you sustain that kind of community standard of compassion and resistance? And so I use that story as a way of talking about the ability of, and it was led by a pastor, André Trocmé, and his church, and I use that as a kind of jumping off point for talking about how it is that during the times that we're in right now, for example, when resistance is much on people's minds, how do we sustain communities that are capable of doing that kind of what appears to be heroic to everybody else work,
right.
But to the people who are doing it seems just like the normal kind of thing. It's not over and above what can be morally expected of us. To those people, it's just what is expected of everybody.
Right. We'll jump into that in a bit, but I want to ask you first, like, I think of the idea of like building a culture, and I think about a firefighter, for instance, and I'm curious if this is kind of what this kind of culture that you're talking about. Like, a firefighter will like run into a burning building to save a life, and people will say, hey, that firefighter is a hero, and the firefighter will be like, hey, I'm just doing my job. Like,
exactly.
And I think I almost want to, like, we're almost seeing this again, as we're recording this. Like, was it last week that came out the news about Trump speaking derogatively about soldiers who've died in battle?
Yep.
And correct me if I'm
him
wrong.
Not getting it.
Right. Because it's like the same thing, right?
Yep.
Like, part of being in the military is this kind of communal, like, I live and die and fight for my brothers and sisters in arms. And for the president who's lived his whole life on just me. So it's like, so much of it, if I'm hearing right, is just creating that culture.
Exactly. And that's what the military does, for instance. You don't come out of the womb snot-nosed and crying thinking that you have a responsibility to do certain things that appear
heroic
to other people. That is a cultural sort of socialization that people have to go through. And my point in the book is that we need to be more intentional about thinking of ourselves in that way, that what we're trying to do in church is not just to get people's celestial bus pass stamped, but to create a community that is capable of living out what we anticipate as the reign of God. That this is what God wanted when God first created the world, right? That we're living out what it is, so that we are a taste of what God intends in this new world that God is creating.
Yeah. So in your book, in the last chapter, you dive into kind of how do we do this? And you don't kind of summarize these quite so much, but for the purpose of the podcast, I kind of broke these into 5 broad themes that I want to talk through. So I'll just read them off here, and then we'll dive into each one here. But as I read the chapter and kind of summarize it, there's kind of like 5 points that I gathered for creating change. One is building a theological framework, and for you, that theological framework is reign of God. Understanding justice versus mercy, and we definitely need to dive into that. Investing in relationships, showing up but not being the hero, and then teaching people to say no. So let's talk again. We've kind of talked about it, but talk about the importance of the theological framework of the reign of God.
Well, that's sort of jumping off what I was just talking about. That the reign of God is not, as I think as I was taught early on, something that happens after you die. Right? That somehow or another, the kingdom of God, or in Matthew, the kingdom of heaven, is some future reality post-death. But in fact, we don't know what's gonna, we don't know what's gonna happen tomorrow, let alone all of the intricacies of what happens after you die and so forth. What we have control over is trying somehow to embody the reign of God that we anticipate is what God intends for the world right here and right now. And so that's not just a kind of personal emotional feeling or a personal spiritual connection. Although, I'm not saying those things are bad. I'm just saying that they're not sufficient. They're not sufficient for what is intended, I think, by the reign of God. And that is, it's more social, it's more political, in the way that we have been talking about, which is ordering our life together.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, as I see it, like, this is where this theological framework or foundation is really important, because if not, justice and mercy, which we'll talk about next, kind of becomes this kind of like, if not an afterthought, but like second fiddle to what you said of like, hey, we've got to get people saved, we got to save their souls, and then if there's time afterwards, we'll do that.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. And that was my experience, and frankly, kind of my experience for many years as a disciple, just in a more liberal way. Right. Interesting. And I think that we have to move beyond this assumption that what we're doing here is only kind of making a down payment on heaven in the future.
I love the way you say that.
It has ramifications for people's lives and therefore my own life right now.
I'm curious, what did it look like for you, even in a more liberal context of like saving souls?
Well, I mean, there was still this underlying assumption that politics was something that happened out there. And that religion was merely about, it was kind of, it was obviously vertical. And there was horizontal stuff, but that was always ancillary. It felt like to me.
So the church's job, as in a more quote unquote liberal context, is still about the me and God thing, that vertical thing. That's great.
Well, I mean, think about it. Think about how many disciples churches right now, pastors are absolutely, over the past 4 years, are absolutely vexed and
Yeah.
confounded by
Yeah.
how to be a pastor
Yep.
in a time where there is political division in the country, because if you speak on one side, you're going to get bitten on the other, and vice versa. And so they just sort of, it's easier to stay away from it.
Yeah. One of the images that I've always liked, Diana Butler Bass has talked about, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has talked about,
Oh, absolutely.
like the image of like the religion used to be kind of like the priest or the pastor being like the elevator operator and just taking people like, like
Yes,
up to
and down.
heaven, down to hell. And now it's like a more kind of horizontal, like cultivating relationships. But like, as you said, like if we understand religion as just like this elevator, like that's obviously gonna, like, we can't really talk about things on the horizontal plane because, hey, that's not what religion is about. And like you said, even in mainline context, like there's still kind of that basic cosmology, I think, if that's a fair word.
Yes.
That's
No, I think that's right. The kind of working model for so many pastors, as you describe it, an elevator sort of model, doesn't really allow you to say killing Black men by the police is not only a tragedy, it's an abomination against God. There's just no way that you can convince me that were Jesus standing here today in the midst of our cultural tumult, that he would be concerned about, passing tracts or singing praise choruses or whatever, when the world seems to be burning down. I mean, he was always right in the middle of it.
Have you, Derek, I'm guessing you have not been following the Bethel worship pastor, Sean Fucht, I think. I don't even know how to say his name, but like literally, like that's what he did. He's like, he took a worship band to like Minneapolis to like Portland and was like playing praise and worship. And it's like, and then it's like wondering why people are pissed off at him. And I mean,
it feels so, pardon the expression, but it feels so masturbatory, right?
Oh, yeah.
That it's really about me. And if my goodness can impact you, that's great.
Yeah.
But that's not how I read Jesus at all.
Well, let's keep going here, because I think we could stay in that point for like another 20 minutes. But you have so many good points here in this chapter. So you talk about the difference between justice and mercy, and you kind of lay out like injustice in the prison population, why people of color are incarcerated so much more than others, income inequality, healthcare inequality, and you talk about these are all questions of justice, issues that cannot be solved by acts of mercy, no matter how well or grand or well-intentioned. And I think this is a huge point of distinction. So I want you to keep diving into it, because I think in so many churches, mainline, evangelical, across the board, we do acts of mercy, and we're cool with doing acts of mercy. But when it comes to this more like systemic justice thing, we're like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that really sort of harkens back to the question you asked me about my experience as a sort of liberal mainliner. And the assumption is what you do are acts of mercy. So you almost across the board,
food banks,
evangelical mainliners, you do a food pantry or a clothing closet or a soup kitchen or whatever. And those things are great. I mean, those things are good.
Right.
But that's really ultimately kind of a Band-Aid over really much deeper issues. And, the really famous one could possibly argue the sort of siren call of liberal Christianity has been, Micah 6:8.
Yeah.
What does God require of you but to do mercy,
Justice, love mercy.
do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.
Yeah.
And we do the walk humbly with God stuff and the mercy stuff, but we rarely, in my experience, concentrate on the justice stuff, which is structural. So when we talk about systemic racism or the patriarchy or houselessness or hunger, those things you can deal with the houseless population by feeding them, but that doesn't get to these acts of mercy don't get to the problem of why they're hungry in the first place. Right? Or why they don't have adequate housing, or why it is that despite the best intentions of let's give every legal in the justice system the benefit of the doubt and say that they're all good people. Well, fine, but the outcomes are still disproportionately against Black men, in particular, and Black people in general. And so you also have to, I think, become advocates for change, which is itself a really political kind of act. And I think that's part of why people are nervous about that. And to the extent that evangelicals have sort of gotten on that part of the bandwagon, it's been about issues like marriage equality or abortion or whatever, prayer in schools, but those things are. I won't go down that road, but
yeah. Well, a third thing you talk about when it comes to creating change is this idea of investing in relationships. You say social justice work requires relationships, and relationships require trust, which we know trust takes time to build, you say, and can't be broken into in no time at all. And I think talk about kind of how this is a big part of what you do in Louisville. Talk about some of the ways you've been able to build and foster those relationships. And I want to, I'll speak for me at least, and I'm curious your take on this too, especially as a white man, as a straight white man. I'm curious, like, if you'd be willing to share some of the ways that you've had to really invest to foster trust when you go into communities of color.
Yeah. Well, and communities of color, and another community that's really wary is the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
And you have to spend time. I mean, you just have to spend time being there. You don't show up and sort of take over the spotlight.
Yeah.
You have to build up credibility because, I mean, because these are groups of people, refugees, the immigrant community. These are people who have had many times really bad experiences with institutions.
Yeah.
And in some cases, institutions like the church are the worst offenders.
Yeah.
And so you have to build up credibility by just being there and being a normal person, being caring and compassionate. And one of the things I say in the book, and one of the ways I talk about my job really as a pastor, is to figure out ways to say yes. So if somebody comes to our church, one of these groups comes to our church and says, "Can we use space?" Or when we had a van, would you drive us? Would you be willing to loan the van out to groups of people to the state capitol? Or can you provide water? Or could we store the stuff for the houses? How can we be here to serve you? I mean, one of the things that I learned as a minister growing up in the disciples, and I expect this is true in a lot of cases,
Yeah.
is this sort of a tractional method
Yeah.
of evangelism, which
Yep.
is sort of, you go out, the model is you porch, and you have to figure out ever newer and more novel ways of telling people, you should come in here.
Yeah.
Right? We have everything you want in here. Well, why should people listen to us?
Mm-hmm.
The thing I think that we need to do, and this is what Jesus did, is what if we went out into the community
Mm-hmm.
and said, if you ever come to our building, to our worship service, that's fine. But we're doing this not because we're trying to trick you into coming. We're not
Yeah.
we're not giving you food or having a daycare or whatever to trick you into coming into our church. We go out and say, what do you need? We're servants, and we do the things that we do because it's the right thing to do, not because we expect to get any benefit from it. And it takes time for people to trust that.
Yeah. Well, it kind of gets into this fourth point of showing up and not being the hero. And I'll speak maybe just white people, especially. We like to be the hero, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting to talk to people in marginalized communities whose experience is always a kind of suspicion of allies,
Mm-hmm.
partly because allies are there when the cameras are there.
Yeah.
Right. And they kind of slink away when the bullets start flying.
Yeah.
And so there's not a great deal of trust until you come in and you say, I'm not here for me, I'm here for you. And some practical ways of doing that. And this is hard. I mean, I know this is hard because people like you and I, straight, white, middle class, Protestant males,
we're as washed as it gets. Yeah.
Yeah, they when the news team, when the reporters show up, they look for people who look like us.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to want to be the person who's there talking to them.
So don't be that person.
Right. No. So
at most basic level, like
we need
don't
to
be the person to talk to the press. I guess even at
if you're the only one there or whatever, that's one thing. But we always need to be conscious of trying to figure out how it is that we can center other people who really whose problem is really it. Because for the most part, these aren't our direct problems.
Right.
But they are our problems because we're part of a community, part of a body, as Paul puts it.
Yeah.
And when the toe hurts, everything hurts.
Yeah.
And so we need to be really intentional about putting other people forward. And that's that's a way to build trust. If folks see that you're not just there to sort of burnish your resume or whatever.
Yeah.
Your public image.
Yeah. You have one other thing I wanted to highlight, the idea of learning to say no to powers and principalities. So talk to me a little bit about that. What does that look like?
Well, for one thing, I think for me, it starts in the pulpit. I mean, if you've never mentioned race before from the pulpit, then what are you going to say on June, at the 1st of June this year, when everything is up in air? If you have not sort of laid out how you think it is that the church relates to political and civic institutions all along, then people have no way of conceiving not only how to challenge those things, but why you should in the first place.
Yeah.
So learning how to say no entails from, if you're a pastor, I think, in teaching and in preaching, sort of drawing those distinctions,
Mm-hmm.
and helping the community learn that they have more responsibility than just their own fulfillment. What do I get out of the worship service? What do I get out of church?
Mm-hmm.
We need to flip that and say, what is it that what gifts do I have to bring to the church that will translate to mission to the world?
Yeah. Now, kind of related to this, you have some practical advice at the end of the chapter, just for pastors and church leaders of like, hey, before you jump too much into this, like talk to your leadership team, talk to
Yeah.
your board, talk to your elders, whatever. I can imagine you probably heard stories of pastors who start down this kind of train track, and the
Mm-hmm.
leaders get in a tizzy. So
Oh yeah.
give some practical advice there for leaders and
Well,
pastors.
one of the things I said for leaders and pastors is, you probably ought to have some frank discussions about under what circumstances is it okay for me to get arrested,
Oh yeah, yeah.
right? Because you don't want to be doing what you think is right and get arrested, and then have the leadership of the church say, we thought this was fine, but we saw the headlines in the paper, and this just reflects badly on us and stuff. So you need to be frank up front about what the costs associated with living this gospel out. And so having constant conversations, not just about getting arrested, but about what does this entail for people who are trying to be faithful to Jesus.
That's great. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back with some closing questions.
It's not like we haven't all said it enough lately. These are unprecedented times. COVID-19 has upended the way we do life, community, and church. As church leaders, we find ourselves disoriented. Outreach, connection, cultivating a sense of team among church staff and creatives, nothing works like it did before. Torn Curtain Arts gets it, and we're here to help. We strengthen the creative soul of churches. It's why we exist. And in these times, we have dedicated ourselves to helping churches set up live streaming solutions and assisting with live events. We also provide coaching for worship leaders, as well as substitute worship leading for both in-person and online events. Contact us at torncurtainarts.org and let's chat about how we can keep you connected to your creativity in this season and grow your community.
All right, we're back with Dr. and Ninja Derek Penwell. So Reverend Doctor.
Yeah, Reverend, yeah, whatever.
You can
just
be
Derek
like,
is fine.
You can be like Dr. Reverend Dr. Penwell. How about that?
Yeah, I get teased about that sometimes.
All right. You can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to, but
sure.
if you were Pope for a day, is there one thing you'd like to do?
I think what I would do is to make explicit to congregations and to the church as a whole that we have a stake in what happens to people beyond just our own personal salvation. We have a stake in the kinds of situations that people talk about around the dinner table or around the water cooler at work, that we are very much engaged with the world in that in those things. And so being upfront and setting up a sort of permission structure for people, pastors in particular, to be able to say, the fact that Breonna Taylor was killed in my city by police, not as she was sleeping, but woken up from sleep,
Right.
is wrong. It's just against what we stand for as Christians. To be able to say that, I think is what I would want to impress on everybody.
Good. Do you have a theologian or a Christian historical figure you want to meet or bring back to life?
It's not really even my favorite theologian necessarily, but I would really like to talk to Dietrich Bonhoeffer at this point in time.
Yeah.
Because I know I will confess that one of the struggles I have is this fury at some of the existing political structures and the machinations that are put in play by those structures right now, and some people. And it's hard for me not to hate people. I mean, I'll just be honest.
Yeah.
I know that's wrong, and I don't want to, and I pray to God to help me overcome that. But I'm not quite sure, how much self-righteous indignation is good and when it becomes harmful, and how do you make that happen. So Bonhoeffer eventually became part of a plot to assassinate Hitler, and I'm not saying that I want to I'm not saying that at all, but but how do you process what you feel to be a dangerous political structure and the implications on your own faith right now? How do you do that over time? I think that would be a really helpful conversation for me right now.
Yeah, that's good. What do you think? I mean, I'm sure you could say a lot to this. What do you think history will remember this current time and place for?
Well, after yesterday, if you'd asked me yesterday morning, I might have had a different answer. But after the revelations from the Bob Woodward book and the taped discussions he had with President Trump, where the president basically said, "Yeah, this is really bad," in private, but then in public, feels like did everything in his power to
downplay it, dismiss it.
To downplay it, yes, to dismiss it. And the result, of course, is that we have, but by the time this is all done, we will have, well north of 300-400, maybe 500,000 people dead from it, and countless lives changed by it. And in the midst of it, of course, also looking at, another thing that came out yesterday was not just about the COVID stuff, but in the midst of the racial unrest in this country, he was asked about white privilege and, somebody who was born to a rich father and stuff. And don't we have a responsibility, Bob Woodward asked him, don't we have a responsibility to try to step outside our own experience, to understand the rage that Black people in particular feel about being constantly targeted by a system that disproportionately punishes them. And he said no. He said I don't feel that way at all. So I think I think that history will remember, obviously, the pandemic and the racial unrest, but the thing that will be really glaring, I think, is what looks like a complete and utter lack of empathy by people in power. The inability to imagine somebody else's life other than your own is, I think, a real
we've seen that even at the beginning when it came to the economic relief bill of like, hey, $1,200, that should be enough for a few months for people. And it's kind of shocking, this kind of utter inability just to do like basic math. I mean, these are supposed to be like really smart people, and like do the math. Like, $1,200, like it's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I mean, the senator in my own state, the House Majority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell,
Yeah.
in the face of what has amounted to be, record unemployment and people, the people being evicted for lack of paying rent or mortgage or whatever, and saying, I don't think we need to do anything right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that point of empathy. Like, I feel like that's been such a huge distinction in this time of like, I'm not going to wear my mask because I don't care.
Yep.
Like, whatever's going on financially in your life, not a problem for me.
Exactly.
We could spend another hour on that. Any guess what Christianity will look like in 500 years?
Nope. I mean, one thing that
I like how you're so succinct. Nope.
I mean, I just don't.
Yeah.
I have no way of knowing it. If I'd have been alive when Martin Luther was alive, I would never have been able to predict what we look like today.
Yeah.
But I will say that, given the trajectory that we've been on for 50 years among the mainline church, which is decline.
Right.
And now even some evangelical denominations are experiencing the same decline. And with the pandemic, this kind of keeping people away from the community, the church, the congregation, has prompted many people to say, when this is all over, are you going back? And they say, no, I'm not, I don't really.
Yeah, the statistics that I'm seeing are pretty shockingly bad.
Yes, they really, really are. But in my first book, the Mainliner Survival Guide to the Post-Denominational World, what I say to that is, because I take that point that we've been declining for years, how should we respond to that? And I said, well, if you get a diagnosis of terminal cancer, you have a variety of ways you could respond to that. Often it's just sort of depression or wailing and gnashing of teeth or whatever. But there are some people who get that, and it becomes a kind of freeing thing. Like, all right, heck, if I'm going to die, I let me do it at least. Do it in style. Let me do it having climbed Mount Everest, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a freeing thing, a liberating thing for the church right now in this situation. I wrote an article one time, the title of which was, what would your congregation do if it never got another member? Right? If this is all you had, how would you act? And the ironic thing about it is, once you start to act that way, sort of without regard to your own self-preservation, people find that really appealing.
Right. That's what's so shocking, so simple but so profound about it. Yeah. Excuse me. All right. Well, where can people find out more about you?
Well, they can go to my website, derekpenwell.net. I'm also on Twitter at RESEUDAIMON, Race Eudaimon, which when I got on Twitter, I was in philosophy, and so that's a kind of juxtaposition of Latin and Greek, race thing, and then eudaimon, which is the good, the excellent thing.
Cool. Well, check out his books. I know, Derek, I definitely want to have you on in the future. We need to talk about your survival, the mainliner survival in the post-denominational world. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate the conversation, and may God's peace be with you.
And you too. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.